Forget everything you think you know about the Middle Ages. No shiny knights, no fairy tale castles. Welcome to Thunga's Story Time, where we dive deep into the brutal, unforgiving reality of medieval life. Imagine sleeping in filth, surviving on moldy bread, and facing danger at every turn. It wasn't just hard, it was a battle for survival. Ready to uncover the shocking truths hidden behind the legends? Hit that subscribe button and join me as we journey back to the darkest, rawest corners of history. Let's get started. A brutal beginning. The harsh start of life in the Middle Ages. Forget what you've seen in movies. Life in the Middle Ages didn't begin with knights in shining armor or princesses in castles. For the vast majority of people, especially peasants, life started in conditions that were anything but noble. Being born in medieval Europe meant entering a world of dirt, darkness, disease, and discomfort, right from day one. Born into filth. Most people in the Middle Ages were born in tiny, one-room homes made of wattle and daub, wooden sticks interwoven with mud and straw. The floors were usually just dirt. There was no such thing as plumbing, insulation, or ventilation. Smoke from the cooking fire hung in the air, stinging the eyes and coating the walls with soot. Babies were born on straw-stuffed beds, mattresses that were never cleaned, often crawling with lice, fleas, and bedbugs. The bedding was rarely replaced and sometimes passed down through generations. Cleanliness wasn't just rare, it was practically non-existent. Midwives did their best, but without knowledge of germs or sterilization, infection was a constant threat for both mother and child. Sharing space with animals. Privacy? That was a luxury medieval peasants couldn't afford. Most families lived in a single-room dwelling. There were no bedrooms, no bathrooms, and definitely no nursery. The entire household, parents, children, maybe a grandparent or two, slept, ate, and lived in one crowded space. And that's not all. In the corner of the room, it was common to find chickens, goats, or even a cow. Animals were too valuable to keep outside where they might be stolen or attacked by wolves. They lived under the same roof as the humans, adding their own smells and ways to the already foul conditions. In the cold months, animals provided a little warmth, but at a steep cost to hygiene. The stench of everyday life. The smell inside a medieval peasant's home would have been overwhelming to modern noses. There were no indoor toilets, waste was thrown into a communal pit outside or, more often, dumped into the street. Chamber pots might be used during the night, but they weren't emptied often or cleaned properly. Without running water, bathing was a rare event. People believed washing too frequently could make you sick. Most children grew up barely knowing what it felt like to be truly clean. Hands weren't washed before eating. Faces weren't cleaned after sleeping. Dirt under the fingernails and layers of grime on the skin were simply part of life. Life without light. Artificial light was another scarcity. The only light source after sunset was the fire in the hearth or a candle, if you could afford one. Families often went to bed not long after the sunset, simply because they had no way to light the room. Children grew up accustomed to the dark and to navigating by memory and feel, not sight. Daylight, when available, poured in through small windows without glass, just holes covered with cloth, wood shutters, or animal bladders stretched thin. These let in cold air in the winter and flies in the summer. Cramped, crowded, and cold. During winter, entire families huddled together for warmth, often under a single blanket. Windows and doors were drafty, and homes had no insulation. The fire burned constantly, but with limited fuel and poor ventilation, it was never enough to truly warm the space. Children learned early on to deal with cold toes and smoky air. The crowding created more than discomfort, it helped disease spread rapidly. If one person got sick, the whole family often followed. Illnesses that today would be considered minor could be fatal in such conditions. Life expectancy was short, and many children didn't make it past their first few years. A different kind of childhood. Unlike modern childhoods filled with toys and early education, a medieval child's first experiences were shaped by survival. There were no cribs, diapers, or formula. Babies were wrapped in cloth and swaddled tightly for months, sometimes not even washed properly after birth. Teething was dangerous, fevers were often misunderstood and untreated. If a child survived infancy, they were expected to help with chores by age 5 or 6. Life wasn't segmented into child and adult spheres. Everything happened in the same room: cooking, eating, sleeping, giving birth, dying. There were no boundaries, no childproofing, no safe spaces. Children witnessed everything and were expected to grow up fast. No royal romance. This was the true beginning for most people in the Middle Ages. No castles, no magic, no fairy tales, just smoke, filth, and hard realities. Yet even in these conditions, people found joy where they could. A warm fire on a cold night, a successful harvest, a baby's first laugh. These moments mattered, even when everything else was brutal. In understanding how life really began for people in the Middle Ages, we gain not just historical insight but a deeper appreciation for the progress humanity has made, and the resilience of the people who lived in that grim, forgotten world. Hygiene was practically non-existent, the dirty truth of medieval daily life. If life in the Middle Ages began in filth, it only got filthier. After entering a world of lice-infested straw beds and livestock roommates, children and adults alike grew up in an environment where cleanliness wasn't just rare, it was virtually unknown. The medieval understanding of hygiene was, by today's standards, shockingly minimal. Sanitation infrastructure was non-existent, and the very concept of personal cleanliness was misunderstood, feared, or completely ignored. No toilets, no privacy, no system. Forget indoor plumbing. In medieval villages, there were no toilets, certainly not private ones. In rural areas, most people relieved themselves in the open, behind trees, in the bushes, or in designated ditches. In towns and cities, it wasn't much better. Some homes might have a chamber pot, a simple bowl or bucket used indoors, but even that wasn't guaranteed. These were rarely emptied regularly and often simply dumped into the nearest open area. The streets of many medieval towns and villages were literal sewers. Human waste was casually tossed out of windows with a shout of warning, or sometimes not even that. Gardes l'eau, French for watch out for the water, became a customary call before emptying chamber pots in some cities. Waste flowed through open gutters that ran through the center of town streets, carrying a foul mixture of urine, feces, animal waste, and garbage. This primitive system, or lack thereof, meant that foul smells constantly hung in the air. Flies swarmed freely, and diseases that spread through human waste, like dysentery and cholera, ran rampant. Toilet paper? Not a chance. Toilet paper was unheard of in the Middle Ages. Instead, people made do with whatever was at hand. Leaves, grass, moss, hay, rags, seashells, or even their own hands were common substitutes. In cold weather, snow might be used, more effective than nothing, but far from ideal. In castles or monasteries, places with more resources, there were primitive latrines, essentially holes in stone that emptied down into a pit or the moat. These were reserved for the elite and often still stank horribly. Servants had the thankless job of cleaning them out. For everyone else, especially the peasantry, bathroom time was a public, uncomfortable, and unsanitary affair. Bathing, a suspicious activity. Bathing wasn't a regular part of life for most people. In fact, it was sometimes viewed as dangerous. Some believed that opening the skin's pores with hot water made the body more vulnerable to illness. Others saw it as a form of vanity or luxury, and therefore sinful. Public bathhouses existed in some cities, and for a time, they were popular. People of all social classes might use them, and for the wealthy, it became a social event. But over time, especially as diseases like syphilis began to spread and the bathhouses gained a reputation for immoral behavior, the practice declined. By the late Middle Ages, bathing had become infrequent, especially among the lower classes. Most peasants might go months, or even years, without a proper bath. When they did clean themselves, it was often by wiping down with a damp cloth or rinsing hands and faces with water from a bucket. Soap was rare and expensive, often handmade from animal fat and ashes. Many never saw a bar of it in their lifetime. Hair, hands, and rotting teeth. With such infrequent washing, lice, fleas, and ticks were constant companions. Head lice were so common that delousing became a routine social activity. Women might sit in the evenings and comb through each other's hair, crushing lice between their fingernails or on hot stones. Hands were rarely washed before meals, and because utensils were a luxury, many people ate with fingers coated in grime. Infection from cuts and scrapes was common and often fatal. As for oral hygiene, there was none. Toothbrushes didn't exist. Some people chewed twigs to clean their teeth, but this was far from universal. Rotten teeth, gum disease, and unbearable breath were normal. Toothaches were treated with herbs, spells, or by pulling the tooth entirely, usually by a barber or blacksmith, without anesthesia or sterilization. Filth was everywhere. Medieval streets weren't paved, and mud was a constant presence, especially in the rainy seasons. But this mud wasn't just soil and water. It was mixed with dung, garbage, and rot. Walking anywhere meant splashing through filth, and shoes, if you had them, were little protection. People often brought this mess straight into their homes. Garbage collection didn't exist. Rotting food, animal bones, and broken tools were thrown into the street or heaped outside the house. Rats and wild dogs fed freely. Disease followed close behind. In towns, the overcrowded conditions only made matters worse. Narrow alleyways trapped the stench. Fresh air was a luxury. Pigs roamed freely, rooting through piles of trash and human waste. And yet, to the medieval mind, this was simply life. People had adapted to the smells, the dirt, the discomfort, the deadly cost of poor hygiene. While today we understand the link between sanitation and disease, medieval people did not. Illness was usually blamed on bad air, miasma, imbalanced bodily fluids, or divine punishment. The idea that human waste could cause sickness was not widely understood. As a result, plagues and epidemics struck repeatedly and brutally. The Black Death of the 14th century, which wiped out an estimated third of Europe's population, was worsened by these filthy conditions. Fleas, rats, and poor sanitation made cities into death traps. And yet, even in the wake of such tragedy, hygiene practices changed very slowly. A world bathed in dirt, not water. To us, this world seems unimaginable. But for the people who lived in it, filth was the default setting. Clean water was scarce, soap was a luxury, and privacy didn't exist. Hygiene wasn't neglected because people didn't care, it was neglected because they didn't know better, and had no tools to do otherwise. Still, even in the midst of this daily crime, people lived, loved, and laughed. Children played in the mud. Families gathered around hearths. Life pushed forward, even if the streets ran with waste. Meals were meager and dangerous, eating to survive in the Middle Ages. If the Middle Ages were dirty and uncomfortable, they were also hungry. Food in medieval Europe was not only scarce and monotonous, it was often downright dangerous. After being born into filth and growing up surrounded by disease, a medieval peasant also had to fight a daily battle with food that could either keep them alive or kill them slowly. Eating wasn't about enjoyment or nutrition. It was about survival. For most people, especially peasants, the food was bland, repetitive, and filled with risk. Breakfast, thin porridge and stale bread. The day typically began with a meager breakfast, if there was one at all. The most common morning meal was a bowl of pottage, a thin gruel made from boiled water, old grain, and whatever vegetables were lying around, often wilted or bruised. There was no sugar, no butter, no cream, just hot, gray mush. It filled the stomach but didn't offer much energy. Bread was a staple of the medieval diet, but it was nothing like the soft loaves found in modern bakeries. Medieval bread was hard, coarse, and often stale. To make their limited supply of grain last, bakers sometimes mixed in cheaper fillers like ground beans, bark, or even sawdust, a practice that could cause digestive problems, malnutrition, or worse. The poor often received what was called horse bread, a dense, barely edible loaf made with whatever was available. The water was worse than the food. Drinking water in medieval towns and villages was almost always unsafe. There were no water treatment systems. Wells were often shallow and contaminated by nearby cesspits, garbage heaps, or human waste dumped in the streets. Streams and rivers doubled as sewers. To avoid illness from drinking water, even children drank weak beer, called small beer, throughout the day. It was very low in alcohol, 1 to 2%, just enough to kill off some bacteria, and made safer than water. It didn't get you drunk, but it was often the only liquid option that wouldn't lead to dysentery or worse. Wine was another alternative, but it was expensive and reserved for the wealthy or religious institutions. Milk was available only during certain seasons and spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Dinner, reheated mush in questionable additions. The main meal of the day, typically eaten around midday, wasn't much of an upgrade from breakfast. If anything, it was just more pottage, perhaps with a different combination of vegetables or, on rare occasions, a scrap of meat or fish. Protein was hard to come by, and meat was a luxury for peasants. If an animal died of illness, some might still eat it, despite the risk of sickness. Spices were rare and expensive. Salt was used to preserve meats, but its scarcity made it valuable enough to be used in trade. Most food was bland and overcooked, not out of culinary habit, but to kill bacteria and stretch it farther. Leftovers were common, not by choice but out of necessity. Meals were often reheated multiple times, sitting out for hours or days in the open air. With no refrigeration, spoilage was constant. Eating off food was just a reality. People built up tolerance, or they didn't. Food poisoning was frequent, and gastrointestinal issues were part of daily life. Spoilage and contamination were the norm. Rotten food wasn't always easy to avoid. The preservation methods available were limited: drying, salting, smoking, or pickling. All were labor-intensive and not always effective, especially in damp or warm climates. As a result, most food didn't last long. Meat and fish could turn foul within hours, and often did. Bread, too, was not safe. Rye, a common grain, was sometimes infected with ergot, a toxic fungus that could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. Some historians believe ergot poisoning may have contributed to strange outbreaks of dancing plagues and madness in medieval Europe. Eating in the Middle Ages meant constantly gambling with what was on your plate. Hunger often outweighed fear. The stomach groaned louder than caution. The illusion of the feast. When people think of medieval meals, they often imagine grand feasts with whole roasted pigs, overflowing platters, and goblets of wine. Those scenes belonged to kings, nobles, and clergy, a tiny fraction of the population. Even the better-off townspeople lived off a repetitive diet of bread, onions, leeks, cabbage, beans, and turnips. Fruit was available in the right seasons, but fresh produce spoiled quickly. Peasants often foraged for wild herbs, roots, and berries, but even this could be dangerous, as many plants were toxic and mistaken for edible ones. Occasionally, peasants might supplement their diets with game meat, like rabbits, birds, or deer. But hunting on noble lands was illegal, and getting caught could result in harsh punishment, or death. This left people to trap small animals or fish in secret, constantly risking their safety just to add flavor to their bowls. The danger didn't end in the kitchen. Food safety was further compromised by poor cooking environments. Most homes had only a single hearth in the center of the room. Fires were difficult to control, and smoke often filled the entire house. Cooking pots were made of iron or clay, heavy, fragile, and not always clean. Rats and insects were everywhere. Dishes weren't washed properly, and leftovers might be stored on the floor or hanging from the rafters. Cutlery was a rarity. Many people used their fingers, sharing bowls, mugs, and knives. Cross-contamination was a guarantee. Illness spread not just from the food, but from the hands, utensils, and dishes around it. Food, a constant struggle. Eating wasn't just a necessity, it was an effort, a burden, and a risk. Malnutrition was rampant. Many peasants were chronically underfed, their bodies worn thin from hard labor and poor diet. Children often grew up stunted, and mothers struggled to produce enough milk for their infants. Bones were brittle, teeth fell out early, and immune systems were weak. And yet, people found joy where they could. A handful of nuts, a ripe apple in season, a lucky day with fresh eggs or a neighbor's shared stew, these were the small blessings that made medieval life bearable. Clothing and skin diseases, what you wore could make you sick. If the food could poison you and the water could kill you, then your clothes might slowly drive you insane. In the Middle Ages, what you wore wasn't about style, it was about survival. But survival didn't mean comfort. For most people, clothing was a source of daily misery, bringing constant discomfort, relentless itching, and dangerous skin conditions. One outfit to last a lifetime. For peasants and laborers, the vast majority of the population, clothing was not a rotating wardrobe. Most people owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothes in their entire lives. A single tunic, a coarse dress, maybe a cloak if they were lucky. These garments were made from rough wool or homespun linen, thick and scratchy, poorly dyed, and barely shaped to fit. There was no closet to choose from in the morning. You simply wore the same thing every day, often for weeks or even months without washing. Clothes were taken off only for bathing, if bathing ever happened, or for patching when they were so threadbare they couldn't cover you decently anymore. Wool, warm, itchy, and irritating. Wool was the primary fabric for everyday wear. It was durable, warm, and widely available, but also heavy and itchy. Processing wool was a manual, labor-intensive task. It wasn't softened with chemical treatments or brushed with conditioners like modern textiles. The result was clothing that chafed the skin, especially when worn in layers or rubbed raw by belts and tools. In the summer, wool made you sweat. In the winter, it absorbed moisture and held it close to your body. Either way, it created the perfect breeding ground for rashes, fungal infections, and sores. Linen, when available, was preferred for underclothes. It was lighter and somewhat softer, but it was expensive and more delicate. Most peasants couldn't afford it. If you were rich, you might wear fine linen under your outer clothes to help protect your skin. If you were poor, you wore what you had, and it hurt. Rarely washed, always dirty. Laundry was a luxury. Washing clothes was laborious, time-consuming, and involved hauling water, boiling it, and using harsh, lye-based soaps, if any were available at all. Most villagers simply didn't wash their clothes regularly. Garments became embedded with sweat, oil, mud, feces, and food. They grew stiff with grime and cracked at the seams. The result was a fabric that harbored bacteria, parasites, and disease. Skin ailments were rampant. Itching was constant. Scabs, boils, and ulcers formed under seams and folds. Children cried themselves to sleep scratching raw patches. Adults simply endured. Laundering was done a few times a year, often before major religious holidays or village festivals. For most of the time in between, people simply brushed off the dirt or let the rain do the work. Infestation, fleas, lice, and mites. In medieval Europe, lice weren't just common, they were expected. Everyone had them. Rich or poor, clean or filthy, it didn't matter. Lice burrowed into scalps and seams, laid eggs, and caused intense itching. Fleas and mites infested bedding and cloaks. Skin was left irritated, scabbed, and often infected from relentless scratching. The solution? There was a one. People combed their hair with bone or wood combs to remove lice manually. Sometimes, they shaved their heads and wore wigs to manage the problem, but only the wealthy could afford wigs. The rest lived with parasites crawling on their bodies. Some folks wore linen underlayers in hopes of protecting themselves, but even those became breeding grounds. Peasants developed the skill of crushing lice between their fingernails, often in public, without shame. Children were taught to do the same. These parasites didn't just itch, they carried typhus, trench fever, and other illnesses. But in a world with little understanding of infection, the link between bugs and disease went unnoticed. Shoes were optional, and often useless. Footwear was another sore point, literally. Many peasants didn't have shoes, especially children. When they did, shoes were simple leather soles, often tied on with strips of fabric or twine. There were no standardized sizes, no arch support, and no protection from weather or terrain. In wet months, shoes soaked through and stayed damp for days. In cold months, they froze. Feet became cracked, frostbitten, or blistered, sometimes leading to infections or long-term deformities. Socks? Not unless you could afford extra cloth. People wrapped their feet in rags or stuffed them with straw. Again, survival, not comfort, was the goal. Skin disease as a way of life. With poor hygiene, itchy clothes, and parasitic infestations, skin disease was a constant companion. Scabies, ringworm, and impetigo were widespread. Children and adults developed rashes that never healed, lesions that festered, and infections that left permanent scars. Most of these conditions went untreated. Physicians rarely dealt with skin issues unless they were life-threatening or obviously contagious. Remedies were usually herbal, poultices made of garlic, onion, honey, or ash. Some people believed skin diseases were punishments from God or signs of moral failing. Superstition mixed with ignorance, and treatments often did more harm than good. Clothing as a social marker. Clothing also marked your place in the social hierarchy. The nobility wore layers of silk, fur, and fine dyed wool, often regulated by sumptuary laws that restricted what peasants could wear. A peasant seen in bright blue or scarlet cloth could be fined, or worse. These laws ensured that social classes were visually distinct, even if the rich occasionally itched under their layers of brocade and fur. But for the common folk, there was no pretense. Their clothes were their chains, heavy, itchy, worn thin, and constantly reminding them of their place in the world. No dental care to speak of, a mouthful of misery. By now, you've been cold, itchy, hungry, and surrounded by filth. But there's another kind of medieval agony that crept in quietly, built up over time, and often ended in screams: life without dental care. In the Middle Ages, oral hygiene was not a concept. It wasn't neglected, it simply didn't exist. No toothbrush, no toothpaste, no relief. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no floss, nothing resembling a dentist's chair. If you were lucky, maybe you chewed on a twig to freshen your breath or rubbed your teeth with a cloth dipped in ashes or salt water. But these were rare practices, and they did little to prevent the slow, painful deterioration of your mouth. Most people never cleaned their teeth in any meaningful way. The result? By the time they were in their 20s or 30s, tooth decay was rampant, gums were swollen and bleeding, and breath was unbearable. You didn't need to be up close to someone to smell their rotting teeth, you could often smell them coming. And since diets were heavy in coarse bread, dried fruits, and occasionally honey, sugar and starch clung to teeth, feeding bacteria and speeding decay. Combine this with the lack of brushing, and mouths quickly became breeding grounds for infection. Gum disease, a common curse. Swollen, inflamed gums were a way of life. Gingivitis was more common than not. Many suffered from periodontal disease, a chronic infection of the gums and bones that hold teeth in place. Gums would recede, teeth would loosen, and eventually fall out or break off, sometimes while eating. When this happened, you kept eating anyway. You had no choice. Missing teeth meant chewing with your gums, a painful and bloody process, especially with the hard, coarse bread that made up the bulk of the medieval diet. Sores developed in the mouth, some of which became infected or ulcerated, and there were no antibiotics to stop the spread. Toothaches, a constant, unavoidable pain. One of the most dreaded pains in medieval life was the toothache. Not the dull, annoying ache of a modern cavity, but the sharp, throbbing, soul-crushing pain of an abscessed tooth. Infections would burrow deep into the jaw, causing swelling, fever, and delirium. There was no end in sight, no root canals, no fillings, no antiseptics. You suffered for days, even weeks, until the pain either faded, the tooth fell out, or you died from the infection. These infections could become systemic. Cases of sepsis or face rot were not uncommon. Pus-filled cysts could disfigure the face or travel to the brain. Some people died from what began as a single infected molar. There was no morphine, no ibuprofen, not even aspirin. You might be given herbs like clove or willow bark, or apply poultices of garlic and wine, but they were weak remedies. Mostly, you just endured the pain, prayed it would pass, or begged someone to pull the tooth out. Tooth extraction, barbers and brutality. If you were desperate and brave, you sought out a barber surgeon, not a trained dentist. Barbers handled haircuts, bloodletting, wound stitching, and yes, tooth extraction. And they did it with terrifyingly crude tools. There was no anesthesia, no sterilization, and no understanding of dental anatomy. You sat in a chair or were held down while the barber used iron pincers to rip the tooth out of your jaw. If the tooth broke, they kept digging. If your gum tore open, they poured wine on the wound and hoped for the best. People screamed, fainted, and sometimes died from shock or blood loss. But it was the only way to end the pain. In towns and markets, public tooth pulling was sometimes performed on the street, with spectators watching, an early form of crowd entertainment. Superstition over science. In many communities, toothaches weren't seen as infections or physical conditions, but as divine punishment or demonic torment. Medieval medicine was still governed by the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and tooth pain was often thought to be the result of imbalance or tooth worms burrowing in the enamel. Yes, tooth worms. A widely held belief in the Middle Ages was that small, living worms lived inside teeth and caused pain by chewing on nerves. Remedies included smoking them out, applying burning herbs, or inserting red-hot metal rods into the gum to kill them. These treatments often caused more damage than relief. A smile worth hiding. With no dental hygiene and teeth falling out by middle age, smiling was often avoided. The wealthy could sometimes afford artificial teeth, usually carved from animal bone or ivory and tied to remaining teeth with wires. These rarely fit well and were incredibly painful. The poor had no such options. By the time someone reached old age, if they did, they often had no teeth at all. Eating became a matter of mashing food with the gums, soaking bread in beer, or relying on soups and porridge. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Poor nutrition from lack of chewing could weaken an already fragile body. Bad breath, or halitosis, was ever present. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was a marker of health. People learned to speak with their mouths closed or avoided closeness. But there was no escape in shared, cramped homes. The stench of rot hung in the air with every breath. Mouth disease and social isolation. There was a quiet social cost to dental neglect. People who had especially visible or painful conditions, swollen faces, jaw tumors, missing lips or cheeks from infection, were often shunned. Without an understanding of germs, such afflictions were thought contagious or cursed. People were cast out of villages, treated as lepers, or isolated in religious hospitals. For children, the suffering started young. Baby teeth rotted early. By age 10 or 12, some kids were already losing permanent teeth. Tooth pain made it hard to concentrate, eat, or sleep. There was no such thing as growing out of it. You grew into it, and it only got worse. Hard labor every day, no days off, the endless grind of medieval life. After enduring filth, hunger, disease, and dental agony, one might hope that life in the Middle Ages at least allowed some rest. But that hope would be crushed under the weight of the plow, because for most people, there was no such thing as a day off. Peasants, the backbone of feudal life. Roughly 90% of the population during the Middle Ages were peasants, poor farmers who lived on and worked the land. But they didn't own that land. It belonged to a lord, and they worked it not for personal gain, but for survival and obligation. Life as a peasant meant waking before dawn and working until sunset, 6 days a week, and on the 7th, you went to church. That wasn't a break, it was mandatory and often followed by more labor. Your life wasn't your own. It belonged to the land. And the land belonged to someone else. Peasants planted, harvested, weeded, built fences, carried water, chopped wood, and cared for animals. Every task was done by hand. No tractors. No machinery. Just sweat, calluses, and aching joints. A good day meant you didn't injure yourself. A bad day could mean a crushed limb or infected wound, and if you couldn't work, you didn't eat. Fields, forests, and backbreaking tasks. The work varied by season, but it never let up. In spring, peasants tilled heavy, rocky soil with wooden plows dragged by oxen. The plow was inefficient and the oxen slow, but it was all they had. Hands were blistered, backs strained. Then came sowing seeds, bent over for hours, day after day. In summer, the sun was punishing. Weeding, watering, and tending crops were relentless tasks. Insects swarmed. Blisters turned into infections. If the harvest failed, the consequences were starvation. Fall brought harvest season, the most intense period of the year. Everyone, men, women, children, worked the fields. Sheaves of wheat and barley were gathered by hand, bound, carried, and threshed to separate grain from chaff. No shortcuts. No breaks. Winter didn't bring rest. It brought maintenance and survival, fixing tools, thatching roofs, caring for livestock, chopping firewood. Snow and ice didn't stop the work. You trudged through frozen mud because life demanded it. And when the ground froze and food grew scarce, you lived off dwindling stores of grain, root vegetables, and hope. Women, double burden, half the recognition. Medieval women did not live easier lives, they often worked harder. Women were expected to labor in the fields beside the men, sowing, reaping, carrying. Then they were expected to run the household, cook every meal, spin wool, weave cloth, patch clothing, draw water, care for animals, and raise multiple children in cramped, unsanitary homes. Laundry was an ordeal that took hours, scrubbing cloth in freezing rivers with lye soap that burned the skin. Cooking was done over open fires, often with limited ingredients and utensils. If something broke, women fixed it. If someone got sick, women nursed them, no matter how exhausted they already were. Pregnancy didn't mean rest. A woman might go into labor after a full day's work and return to chores within days. There was no maternity leave. No midwives for the poor. Childbirth was dangerous and often deadly, but it didn't stop the demands of the farm or family. Children, laborers in training. Childhood, as we think of it today, simply didn't exist. By the age of 5 or 6, children were expected to contribute to the household. Little boys helped tend animals, gathered firewood, and ran errands. Girls learned to cook, sew, and care for siblings. By 10 or 12, most were performing full adult labor in the fields. Education? Only the very wealthy received any formal schooling. For peasants, learning came from watching, doing, and enduring. Boys might learn to plow. Girls learned to spin and bake. If you didn't work, you were seen as a burden, even at 8 years old. Work was dangerous for children. Injuries from farm tools, bites from animals, and even accidental drownings were common. But these accidents didn't stop the cycle. Families needed every able body, no matter how small. Feudal obligations, taxes paid in sweat. As if backbreaking labor wasn't enough, peasants owed taxes and services to the lord. These weren't paid in coins, peasants rarely had money. They were paid in crops, livestock, labor, and obedience. You might have to work several extra days per month on the lord's private land, called the domain, in addition to your own fields. You might be required to repair roads, build fences, or serve in local militias. If a noble or king demanded resources, the lord passed that burden on to you. And let's not forget the church. Peasants owed the church a tithe, typically 1/10 of their harvest. That was non-negotiable. Refusal meant spiritual and social consequences. Sometimes you starved so that the church could feast. Pain was a constant companion. With no real medical care, injuries were part of life. People worked through sprained ankles, infected wounds, broken fingers, and illnesses that would sideline a modern worker for weeks. Joint pain was universal. So was arthritis by age 30. Skin became weathered and cracked from constant exposure. Feet were blistered and frostbitten. No gloves, no boots, no rest. And still, the plow had to be pushed, the crops had to be cut, the animals fed. There were no pensions. No retirement. You worked until your body broke, and then you depended on family or charity to survive. Often, you just didn't survive. No days off, ever. Holidays? They existed, but not in the way we understand. Religious festivals were observed, but that often meant more work, not less. You might walk miles to attend mass, prepare special food, or perform extra labor as part of religious observance. And Sundays? They weren't truly restful. After hours at church, often standing the whole time, there were still chores to do. Animals needed feeding. Firewood needed chopping. Meals needed cooking. Rest was a luxury for the powerful. For the peasant, there was no such thing as a weekend. Life was a loop of labor, fatigue, and repetition. You didn't live to work. You worked to avoid dying. Extreme weather, no relief. Nature was another master. If medieval peasants hoped for relief from the backbreaking labor, they would not find it in the weather. In fact, Mother Nature was often just as merciless as the feudal lord. The elements weren't just inconvenient, they were life-threatening. With no insulation, no heating systems, and certainly no air conditioning, the weather dictated the rhythm of life. Every season came with its own set of challenges. Comfort was a concept reserved for nobles, if that. For the vast majority of people, weather was simply another cruel master. Houses that barely counted as shelter. Medieval homes were rudimentary at best. For peasants, the typical house was a single-room hut made of wattle and daub, a wooden frame filled with woven sticks and coated in a mixture of clay, mud, and manure. Roofs were thatched with straw, which leaked during heavy rain and attracted rodents and insects. There were no windows with glass, just holes or wooden shutters. Floors were usually dirt, sometimes strewn with straw or rushes that trapped moisture, mold, and waste. Insulation? Not even a concept. The same wind that whipped across the fields at night blew through the cracks in your home. Inside, the only source of warmth was a central hearth, a fire that smoked constantly and left everything coated in soot. There were no chimneys in early medieval homes. The smoke drifted out through holes in the roof, or didn't. Children and elders often choked on the smoke, developing chronic coughs and respiratory issues. In winter, temperatures inside the house could drop below freezing. You slept fully clothed, sometimes even with animals to share body heat. It wasn't uncommon to wake up with frost on your bedding. In summer, that same poorly ventilated space turned into an oven, baking everyone inside. Privacy was non-existent, and comfort was unheard of. Winter, a test of survival. Medieval winters were long, dark, and brutal. With no central heating and limited firewood, staying warm was a daily struggle. Firewood had to be chopped by hand, carried back in bundles, and used sparingly. The poor often burned dried animal dung as a last resort. It stank, but it provided just enough heat to keep fingers from freezing off. Water buckets would freeze overnight, and indoor frostbite was a real risk. Fingers, toes, and ears could become permanently damaged. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. If the weather didn't kill you outright, it weakened your body enough for illness to finish the job. Food supplies also dwindled. Root vegetables and grains stored for winter would rot or run out. Hunting was difficult, and starvation was a real danger. You rationed everything, sometimes to the point of eating bark, boiled weeds, or spoiled food. And you still had to work. Farms didn't pause because of the cold. Animals needed feeding. Paths had to be cleared. Water needed hauling from half-frozen streams. You did it all in threadbare wool clothing, soaked leather shoes, and numb hands. There were no coats. No thermal gloves. Just grit in the hope you'd see spring. Summer, from sweat to suffering. If winter was cold death, summer was slow torture. During the hottest months, temperatures soared with no relief in sight. There was no shade in the open fields, no hats to protect you from sunstroke, and no water bottles to keep you hydrated. Your one-room house became a stifling oven. The thick walls and thatched roof trapped heat, turning nights into sweaty, sleepless marathons. Flies and insects swarmed the stagnant air. There was no mosquito netting. No fans. You lay on itchy straw bedding, sweating through linen shirts, praying for a breeze that never came. Water sources were few, and those that existed were often polluted or stagnant. Rivers and wells became breeding grounds for disease and the heat. Boiling water was difficult and firewood was precious, so people often drank water as it was, hot, dirty, and dangerous. The summer also brought rot. Food spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Meat had to be eaten immediately or preserved with expensive salt, which peasants couldn't afford. Spoiled food led to violent illnesses, and with primitive medical knowledge, even food poisoning could be fatal. The body, already pushed to its limit by physical labor, now faced dehydration, heat exhaustion, and skin diseases. Children collapsed in fields. Adults fainted in the sun. Nobody stopped. Because the crops needed tending, no matter what. Spring and fall, brief moments of mercy, or misery. Spring could be a time of hope. Flowers bloomed, temperatures rose, and life returned to the land. But it also brought flooding rains, mudslides, and dangerous road conditions. Wet clothing caused rheumatism. Unstable soil made planting dangerous. If you slipped and twisted a leg, you didn't rest, you limped through your tasks, praying the injury didn't get worse. Fall was the harvest season, the most exhausting time of year. Cooler air brought relief, but the frantic pace of gathering crops before the first frost left no time to enjoy it. Days grew shorter. Nights grew colder. And all around you, nature hinted that another brutal winter was on the way. No escape, no safety net. There was no emergency shelter. No warming centers. No local authorities handing out blankets or bottled water. If your roof collapsed in a storm, you rebuilt it, or you froze. If your firewood ran out, you scavenged through snow. If the heat made you collapse, you prayed someone would find you in time. Nature didn't discriminate, but poverty made sure the poor suffered most. The wealthy had stone houses, real fireplaces, thick fur cloaks, and access to stored food and drink. Peasants had none of that. For them, every day was a gamble against the elements. And the house you died in? It would go on housing the next family. The same gaps in the wall. The same smoke-filled air. The same frost on the floor. Water, a source of life, and death. In the Middle Ages, water was supposed to be one of the essentials of life, but for most people, it was a gamble. In fact, for peasants living in filth, water was often more dangerous than useful. You needed it for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and occasionally bathing, but chances were, that same water would make you sick or even kill you. The problem was simple: pollution was everywhere, and people didn't understand how diseases spread. There were no sewage systems, no clean reservoirs, and no real concept of hygiene. Rivers and streams, the primary sources of water, were constantly contaminated by human and animal waste, rotting garbage, dead animals, and industrial runoff from tanners and blacksmiths. And yet, people drank it. Waste in the water. In medieval villages, there were no public sanitation services. Waste had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was often right into the water supply. Privies, primitive outhouses, were few and far between. Many peasants relieved themselves in open ditches or directly into the streets. When it rained, that waste washed downhill into nearby streams and rivers, the same ones used to draw drinking water. Even large towns like London or Paris had rivers that doubled as both sewer and source. Additionally, livestock, pigs, cows, goats, chickens, roamed freely in the streets. Their feces added to the sludge that soaked into the earth or flowed into the streams. Farmers also washed slaughtered animals, blood and all, in the same creeks used for drawing cooking water. The result? Water that was brown, cloudy, and full of disease, though people couldn't see the invisible pathogens causing the problems. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever. These were everyday killers, especially of children and the elderly. People sometimes tried to draw water from cleaner parts of the river, but with no knowledge of bacteria or sanitation, it was largely ineffective. Boiling water was recommended by a few wise individuals, but firewood was too precious to waste on something that looked fine. Bathing, a rare and risky habit. Contrary to popular myth, people didn't avoid bathing because they enjoyed being dirty. They avoided it because they believed bathing made you sick. The prevailing medical theory of the time was based on humor's four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, that were believed to determine your health. Too much cold or wet could unbalance these humors. As a result, submerging yourself in cold water, especially during the winter, was thought to open your pores to disease. Warm water was seen as slightly safer, but most peasants didn't have bathtubs or hot water. Heating a tub required a fire, a large container, and an enormous amount of labor and wood, all resources that were rare for poor families. Instead, people wiped themselves down with a damp cloth, if they bothered to clean at all. Public bathhouses did exist in towns, but they were expensive and increasingly frowned upon by religious authorities, who saw them as places of moral corruption and disease. By the later Middle Ages, bathing had become almost taboo, associated with both physical and spiritual risk. As a result, most people bathed just a few times a year, on holidays or weddings, perhaps. The rest of the time, they simply layered on more clothing and perfume if they could afford it. The smell of the average medieval village was overpowering. The illusion of beer as salvation. Because water was so frequently dangerous to drink, even children were given small beer a week, low-alcohol version of beer that was brewed at home. It was considered safer than water because the brewing process involved boiling, which killed off many pathogens. For peasants, beer was both drink and food. It provided calories and a sense of hydration. But brewing took time, effort, and grain, which could be scarce. In desperate times, people returned to the rivers and wells. And they paid for it. When an outbreak of disease swept through a village, no one blamed the water. Instead, they turned to superstition, religion, or scapegoats. Bad air, sin, witches, or divine punishment were common explanations. The idea that an invisible microbe in water could kill you wouldn't take hold until centuries later. The consequences: death by water. Waterborne illnesses were silent, invisible killers. Unlike a sword or a storm, they didn't make noise, but they left trails of grief. A child might drink from a stream on a hot summer day and be dead by nightfall. An adult could feel fine in the morning and collapse with fever and cramps by evening. The poor didn't have doctors. The village healer might offer herbs, prayers, or bloodletting, but there was no cure. Victims often died in agony, dehydrated, delirious, and vomiting. Whole households could be wiped out in a matter of days. Wells, which might seem like safer alternatives, were often just as contaminated. If a village had only one or two wells, all waste from nearby homes and animals would seep down through the soil. Wells weren't deep enough or protected enough to prevent this. The tragedy was that even when people suspected water was dangerous, they had no alternative. Rainwater could be collected, but it quickly went stale. Boiling was rarely practical. And in the end, you had to drink something. So you took your chances and hoped. A world without clean water. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in a constant state of danger from the very things meant to sustain you. You could die from the air, from your food, from the weather, and especially from your water. Clean water was a luxury only the rich could hope for, maybe from a protected spring or a deep, well-kept well. For everyone else, drinking water was a calculated risk, one taken daily and often fatally. Yet people endured. They survived, adapted, and carried on in a world where even a simple glass of water could be your undoing. Medicine in the Middle Ages, a dangerous gamble. By now, it's clear that life in the Middle Ages was brutal, from the lice-infested straw beds and polluted water to the daily back-breaking labor. But perhaps nothing better illustrates the fragility of medieval life than its approach to medicine. When illness struck, and it struck often, most people turned to a mix of superstition, outdated theory, and dangerous practices. Medicine during this period wasn't rooted in science. There were no germs, no antibiotics, no understanding of infection or immunity. What passed for healthcare was a volatile cocktail of ignorance, desperation, and ancient dogma. If you got sick, your odds of survival weren't much better than rolling dice. The theory of the four humors. At the core of medieval medical thinking was a theory inherited from ancient Greece, the four humors. This idea, passed down from Hippocrates and Galen, claimed that the human body was governed by four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health, they believed, depended on keeping these fluids in perfect balance. If you got sick, the assumption was that one humor had become dominant. The solution? Purge it. Bleed it. Vomit it out. This belief shaped almost every treatment available at the time. Bloodletting, a common cure-all. One of the most widespread, and dangerous, remedies was bloodletting. Whether you had a fever, headache, infection, or even indigestion, there was a good chance a local physician or barber would recommend opening a vein and letting your blood flow. Using knives, scalpels, or even sharp stones, practitioners would slice open the skin to draw blood. The goal was to rebalance the humors by literally draining the excess. No gloves, no antiseptic, no understanding of sterilization. Sometimes, the procedure was done by the local barber surgeon, the same guy who might cut your hair, pull your teeth, and lance a boil. If you were lucky, you just got lightheaded. If not, you'd pass out from blood loss or end up with a serious infection. Children, pregnant women, and the elderly were especially at risk, but nobody was spared. Bloodletting remained popular for centuries, despite its deadly consequences. Leeches and other horrors. If slicing open a vein seemed too messy, some healers turned to leeches, slimy, blood-sucking worms placed on the skin to draw out blood more gently. Leeching was believed to be more precise. Physicians would refer to diagrams showing which part of the body corresponded with which illness, placing leeches on specific veins or organs. Of course, leeches came from dirty ponds, carried bacteria, and sometimes burrowed deeper than expected. Still, the sight of a pale patient covered in writhing black leeches was common in medieval clinics. Purging and vomiting, the internal cleanse. Another approach to healing was purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea to cleanse the system of excess humors or toxins. This was done using herbs, minerals, or animal parts that acted as emetics, to make you throw up, or laxatives, to make you defecate. These treatments often dehydrated or poisoned patients. Yet, vomiting was seen as a good sign. A patient who doubled over in pain, clutching their stomach, was believed to be on the path to recovery. Some doctors used arsenic, mercury, or lead-based compounds as medicine, not realizing the long-term poisoning effects. Others used powdered bones, dried lizard skins, or crushed insects mixed with wine or honey. If it sounds like witchcraft, it practically was. Surgery without mercy. For serious injuries or infections, such as gangrenous limbs, abscesses, or arrow wounds, surgery was the last resort. But in the Middle Ages, surgery was a nightmare. There were no anesthetics. Patients were fully conscious during amputations or trepanning, drilling a hole in the skull to release evil spirits. The only pain relief might be a wooden stick to bite on and a swig of alcohol. Speed was the only virtue. Surgeons raced to cut and cauterize before the patient went into shock. The instruments were rarely cleaned, and infections often followed. More often than not, patients died from blood loss, gangrene, or sepsis within days. A broken leg or a deep wound was practically a death sentence. The role of religion and superstition. Medicine wasn't just primitive, it was entwined with religious belief and superstition. Many illnesses were thought to be divine punishments for sin, so healing often involved prayers, fasting, or pilgrimages. Monks and nuns ran many of the early hospitals, more like hospices than places of healing. They offered food and shelter but little in the way of treatment. Holy relics were pressed to the skin. Saints were invoked. Some people even submitted to exorcisms, believing they were possessed. Witches and demons were also blamed for sickness. Women with healing knowledge, especially herbalists or midwives, were often accused of witchcraft if their remedies failed or if someone died under their care. Fear and faith guided most medical decisions. The wealthy fared no better. If you think the rich had better access to medicine, think again. Wealthy individuals might afford a physician, but these doctors were often educated in astrology and Greek texts, not science or experience. Doctors would check a patient's urine color, pulse, and horoscope to diagnose an illness. Treatments might be fancier, but not safer. Sometimes wealthy patients underwent multiple rounds of bloodletting or purging because they could afford more care, which often meant a quicker death. Ironically, the poor, who couldn't afford extensive treatment, sometimes had better survival rates simply because they weren't subjected to as much medical torture. A world without real medicine. The reality was harsh. Getting sick in the Middle Ages was a roll of the dice, and more often than not, the dice were loaded against you. No antibiotics. No painkillers. No understanding of bacteria or viruses. No safe surgeries or sterilized tools. And no end to the suffering. People learned to live with chronic pain, deformities, and visible infections. Children died from fevers. Women died in childbirth. Men died from infected wounds. And most accepted it as a normal part of life. In a world where everything from your food to your water could kill you, medicine offered little more than hope, and often not even that. Scarcity and spoilage, the daily fight to eat in the Middle Ages. After examining the dark depths of medieval medicine, we now turn to another fundamental challenge of daily life: eating. If disease didn't kill you, hunger or food poisoning just might. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just hard to come by, it was often dangerous when you did find it. In a world without refrigeration, food safety was a gamble. And in a rigid feudal society, access to quality meals was often determined not by need but by social class and privilege. For the vast majority of people, especially peasants, every meal was a battle against spoilage, scarcity, and sometimes even toxicity. No refrigerators, no preservation. Without modern preservation methods, most foods had a very short shelf life. Meats and fish, in particular, began to rot within hours or days, depending on the weather. Salt and smoke were the primary means of preserving animal products, but even those methods couldn't prevent spoilage entirely, and salt was expensive. Crops were seasonal. There were no supermarkets stocked year-round. You ate what was grown locally and only when it was in season. A bad harvest meant hunger. A series of poor seasons meant famine. In many homes, there were no pantries or storage cupboards, just small, poorly ventilated spaces where rodents and insects often got to the food first. Bread, a staple that could kill. Bread was the main staple in a medieval diet, especially for peasants. But even bread came with risks. Made from coarse grains, medieval bread was often dense, dark, and filled with debris, everything from sand and bits of straw to ground-up chalk or even sawdust added to bulk up flour. But the real danger lurked in the mold. Stored improperly, grain could develop ergot fungus, a toxic mold that caused hallucinations, seizures, and even death. Entire villages sometimes suffered mass poisonings, known today as St. Anthony's fire, a terrifying illness linked to ergot-contaminated rye. Imagine waking up to convulsing neighbors, burning skin, or people ranting in delirium. It wasn't witchcraft, it was breakfast gone wrong. Meat was rare and risky. Despite popular medieval feast imagery, meat was a luxury, not a daily staple. Most peasants rarely tasted fresh meat unless it was spoiled or stringy leftovers from the Lord's table. The meat they did get was often from old or diseased animals, salted and dried to last, but still risky. Fish fared no better. Without ice or proper cleaning, it could become putrid fast. Preservation with brine or vinegar only slowed the decay. In some cases, peasants consumed meat that had already begun to rot, simply because there were no alternatives. Sickness often followed, but going hungry seemed worse. Spoiled dairy and rotten produce, milk, butter, and cheese spoiled just as quickly. Without refrigeration, fresh milk lasted only a few hours. Cheese, while more durable, was often hard, moldy, and riddled with maggots. Fruits and vegetables were consumed in season but rarely stored well. By winter, options were limited to dried beans, root vegetables, and whatever had survived pests and decay. Even those basics could carry diseases from contaminated water or unwashed hands. Spices were for the rich. Today, a dash of pepper or cinnamon is a casual gesture. In medieval times, it was a status symbol. Spices like saffron, cloves, cinnamon, or black pepper had to be imported from Asia and Africa by long, dangerous trade routes. Only the wealthiest nobles could afford them. This meant that most peasants ate food that was bland, monotonous, and hard to digest, stale bread, watery soup, and turnips, day after day. The rich, meanwhile, could mask the smell and taste of slightly spoiled meat with exotic spices. Even spoiled food became a sign of opulence, if it was dressed up with enough imported flavor. The perils of poaching. Game meat, deer, boar, rabbit, was abundant in the forests, but hunting wasn't a free-for-all. Forests were owned by the nobility, and the king's deer were off-limits to peasants. Catching a rabbit for your hungry children could be considered poaching, and the punishment was severe: whipping, mutilation, or even death. Traps and snares were used in secret. Entire families could be punished if caught with forbidden meat. So even finding food could be a life-threatening decision. The church and the calendar. Religion played a significant role in when and what people ate. The Catholic Church imposed strict rules on fasting days, when meat, dairy, and sometimes even eggs were forbidden. There were over 150 fasting days per year, including every Friday. This further restricted the already limited diet of the common folk. Meals on fasting days consisted of watery vegetable broth, porridge, or plain bread. The wealthy could bend the rules by eating fake meat dishes, fish molded to look like roasted goose, for example. For peasants, it just meant less nutrition and more hunger. Famine and malnutrition. It wasn't just about what people ate, but how little they had. Famines were regular and devastating, brought on by failed crops, war, disease, or harsh winters. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, killed millions across Europe. During these times, people resorted to eating bark, roots, dogs, rats, or even leather belts. Starvation was so common that parents abandoned or even ate their own children in the worst moments, acts recorded in grim medieval chronicles. Even in good years, malnutrition was widespread, leading to stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and shorter lives. A daily struggle. Every meal in the Middle Ages was a gamble. Will the bread make you sick? Has the meat turned? Are those mushrooms edible or deadly? There were no expiration dates, no safety inspectors, and no plan B. If food ran out, people went hungry. If it was tainted, people got sick. Eating was essential, but always came with a risk. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, food wasn't just nourishment. It was a test, a daily reminder of just how fragile life could be. Under God's shadow, how religion ruled every part of medieval life. After navigating the grim realities of food, illness, and survival in the Middle Ages, it's time to examine what may have been the most powerful force in a person's life: the church. Religion in the medieval world wasn't a personal belief system or something you practiced on weekends. It was a full-blown institution that governed time, controlled knowledge, shaped law, demanded money, and dictated the fate of your soul. No one escaped its reach. In fact, For many, life in the Middle Ages wasn't just about staying alive, it was about avoiding eternal damnation. A calendar written by the Church. In medieval Europe, time wasn't counted by months or seasons as we know them, it was structured around religious festivals, saints' feast days, and holy observances. Christmas, Easter, Lent, Pentecost, and a constant stream of saints' days shaped everything from market schedules to farming cycles. Nearly every day had a religious purpose. Many days were holy days of obligation, requiring people to attend church, fast, or abstain from work. There were also periods of penitence, like Lent, where meat, pleasure, and even laughter were discouraged. The Church owned the calendar, literally and spiritually. Law and order. In God's name, the Church didn't just teach morality, it also enforced laws. Monasteries and bishops held legal power alongside kings and lords. Church courts handled issues ranging from marriage and inheritance to blasphemy and witchcraft. And while civil courts could be harsh, church courts were often worse, especially when spiritual crimes were involved. Accused heretics were tortured or executed. Books considered dangerous were burned. Speaking out against church teachings could result in excommunication, a spiritual death sentence that meant no sacraments, no salvation, and no place in heaven. The Church even decided who could marry, what days they could marry on, and what kind of relationships were acceptable. Divorce? Unthinkable. The line between sin and crime was non-existent. The tithe, a tax you couldn't refuse. Everyone, rich or poor, had to pay the tithe. 10% of their income, crops, or labor went directly to the church. This was not optional. If you refused, you could lose your land, be jailed, or worse. This made the church wealthy beyond measure. In many regions, the church owned more land than any noble or king. The grand cathedrals that dominate medieval towns weren't just places of worship, they were symbols of the church's economic and political dominance. And still, priests told peasants to be grateful, reminding them that earthly suffering would be rewarded in heaven, if they obeyed. Education and information? Church property. If you wanted to learn how to read or write, you had to go through the church. Monasteries and cathedral schools were the only centers of education, and the Bible, written in Latin, was taught as the supreme source of truth. Few commoners could read. Fewer still could understand Latin. That gave the clergy enormous power to control what people believed. Sermons, stained glass windows, and mystery plays were designed to teach moral lessons and reinforce obedience. Questioning religious doctrine wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. Knowledge was sacred, locked away, and guarded. And when universities began to emerge, they were church-run institutions, ensuring that faith and dogma came before science or reason. Fear of hell was real, and constant. Above all, what truly kept people in line was fear, eternal fear. The concept of hell wasn't abstract. It was vivid, terrifying, and inescapable. Paintings showed the damned writhing in flames. Priests preached weekly about divine punishment for sinners. Every misstep, a missed mass, a lustful thought, a lie, could tip the scales toward damnation. Death was ever present in medieval life, and the church capitalized on that fear. Purgatory, a sort of spiritual waiting room filled with torment, awaited those who died with unpaid sins. You could shorten a loved one's time there by paying for special masses or indulgences, another lucrative income stream for the church. Rituals were everything. Baptism, confirmation, confession, communion, marriage, last rites, these sacraments were the milestones of a medieval life. Without them, you were spiritually adrift, cut off from the grace needed for salvation. Weddings and funerals weren't family events, they were religious ceremonies, strictly regulated by the church. Even daily life revolved around rituals, morning prayers, blessings before meals, nighttime devotions. Many people carried religious charms or relics to protect against disease or disaster. Superstition and belief were deeply intertwined. The church offered meaning, comfort, and a sense of order, but also control. Monks, nuns, and the cloistered life. For some, joining a monastery or convent was a way out of the harshness of peasant life. But even this escape required vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Days were rigid. Prayer at dawn, manual labor, study, silence, more prayer. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, preserving ancient texts, but also ensuring that the church controlled the narrative of history, science, and faith. Nuns were often noble-born women who had no marriage prospects. Though cloistered, some rose to positions of influence, within strict limits set by male clergy. Holy wars and crusades. The church didn't just dominate spiritually. It also led armies. The Crusades, declared by popes, were bloody wars waged in the name of God. Soldiers were promised forgiveness of sins if they joined the fight to reclaim the Holy Land. Thousands died. Empires fell. And yet the church's authority only grew stronger. The message was clear, the church was the voice of God on earth, and to defy it was to invite damnation, here and in the afterlife. A life of obedience, the harsh reality for medieval women. Following the deep grip of religion over every aspect of life in the Middle Ages, one cannot overlook a critical piece of this societal puzzle, the status of women. If you were born female during this time, your path in life was often decided before you could even speak. Your role was one of service, silence, and suffering. The church preached humility, and for women, that meant complete submission, first to fathers, then to husbands, and always to God. Girls had no childhood. Childhood, as we understand it today, did not exist for most children, but it was especially grim for girls. While boys might train for apprenticeships or church roles, girls were prepared to become wives and mothers as soon as biologically possible. By their early teens, sometimes younger, girls were married off, often to men much older. These were not love matches. Marriage was a contract, arranged by families to secure land, labor, or status. Consent was not required from the bride. Dowries were expected, and for poor families, having too many daughters was an economic burden. Some were sent to convents, not out of piety, but simply because there wasn't enough to feed them at home. Marriage was a life sentence. Once married, a woman belonged to her husband. Legally and socially, he had full control over her life, body, and property. She could not own land in her own name, and any inheritance she brought into the marriage became her husband's. If he beat her, it was seen as discipline, not abuse. The church taught that a woman's primary role was to obey her husband and bear children. The ideal woman was silent, faithful, and fertile. There was no such thing as marital rape because a wife's consent was presumed perpetual. Divorce was forbidden under church law. Even in abusive or dangerous marriages, women were expected to endure and pray. Widowhood was sometimes the only path to autonomy, but only if she had no sons to control her estate. Endless childbirth, constant risk. Pregnancy was a constant fact of life for married women. Without birth control or understanding of reproductive health, women could expect to bear 8 to 12 children, often more. But childbirth was dangerous, deadly even. Medical knowledge was minimal. Midwives did their best, but complications like breech birth, hemorrhage, and infection claimed countless lives. Maternal mortality rates were high, and even surviving childbirth didn't guarantee a long life. If a child died, which many did, it was the mother's duty to grieve in silence and carry on. The church praised this suffering as saintly. Women were expected to see motherhood as their divine calling, no matter the cost. Domestic slavery by another name. Peasant women didn't just raise children, they worked hard. From dawn until dusk, they managed households, prepared meals, fetched water, mended clothes, tended gardens, cared for animals, and often labored in the fields right alongside men. They had no days off, no time for rest, no personal space. Work was relentless and invisible. If she faltered, her family suffered. If her husband failed, she picked up the slack. There was no recognition, no thanks, just the expectation that she would endure. Among wealthier classes, women's roles were different but still confining. Noble women ran estates and were expected to bear heirs. Their freedom was limited to embroidery, reading scripture, and perhaps overseeing servants. Their lives were gilded cages. No access to education. Education was a luxury few men had, but for women, it was almost non-existent. The church taught that a literate woman was a dangerous woman, capable of questioning doctrine or straying from her duties. Some convents provided basic literacy, but even there, women were discouraged from interpreting scripture. Theology, science, philosophy, all were reserved for men. Female knowledge was associated with witchcraft, temptation, or heresy. Curious women were threats to be silenced. In art and literature, women were often portrayed as temptresses or fools. Eve, not Adam, was blamed for original sin. Mary was venerated only because she was virginal, silent, and obedient, a standard few women could live up to. Punished for their bodies and their minds, the church held tight reins over women's sexuality. Virginity was idolized, and any hint of promiscuity brought shame and severe punishment. Unwed mothers were scorned or exiled. Accused adulteresses could be mutilated, branded, or executed. Women who showed independence, spoke out, or even simply lived alone were often accused of witchcraft. These accusations were deadly. Trials were a sham, and punishments were brutal, burning, drowning, or hanging. It was not unusual for intelligent or outspoken women to be tortured into confessions of sorcery or heresy. The message was loud and clear: a woman who steps out of line risks her life. A life of obedience and spiritual manipulation. Even salvation came with strings attached. A woman's only path to heaven was through obedience to male authority and pious suffering. She was taught that her body was sinful, her voice was a threat, and her mind was secondary. Yet many women still found meaning within these strict confines. Some found strength in faith, solace in motherhood, or purpose in serving their communities. A few even rose to positions of influence within religious orders, but these were exceptions. For the vast majority, life was a cycle of labor, childbirth, and silence. Trapped by tradition, the grim reality for women in the Middle Ages. As the iron grip of the church dictated daily life, another layer of restriction blanketed medieval society, one that impacted half the population simply because of their gender. To be a woman in the Middle Ages was to live under constant control, with little say over your body, mind, or fate. While men toiled in the fields, learned trades, or pursued positions in the clergy, women were ushered down a narrow and unforgiving path, one defined by early marriage, childbearing, and servitude. Married off before maturity, girls were seen not as individuals but as economic and reproductive assets. Most were betrothed as early as 12 or 13, and sometimes even younger. These weren't unions of love, they were contracts, arranged by parents to merge land, wealth, or alliances. In noble families, daughters were bartered as pawns in political games. In poorer households, marrying off a daughter quickly was a means of survival, one less mouth to feed. The idea of choice was virtually non-existent. A girl's consent was rarely considered. Once married, she became legally and socially her husband's property. And once inside the marriage, there was no exit. The church forbade divorce, even in cases of abuse or neglect. A woman's only hope for independence was widowhood, but that often came with financial insecurity or pressure to remarry. Motherhood meant risk, not reward. Married life didn't mean a honeymoon, it meant immediate expectations to produce children. Reproductive health, as we understand it today, didn't exist. Women had no access to birth control, no understanding of fertility cycles, and no say in the timing or number of pregnancies. The result was a near constant cycle of childbirth. 5, 10, even 15 pregnancies in a woman's lifetime were not uncommon. Many of those pregnancies ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. Childbirth itself was a life-threatening event. Without sterile tools or trained doctors, women died frequently in labor from hemorrhaging, fever, or infection. Midwives did their best with herbs and folklore, but even simple complications could prove fatal. For many women, their own mortality was the price of motherhood. Work without recognition. A woman's duties extended far beyond the birthing bed. In peasant households, women worked alongside men in the fields, plowing, planting, and harvesting. Yet, after sunset, their work wasn't over. They prepared food over open fires, carried water from wells, mended clothing, tended animals, and kept the household running, often while pregnant or nursing. Wealthy women didn't escape these burdens, their labor just looked different. Noble women managed estates, organized meals, arranged marriages, and trained servants. But their freedom was limited to the walls of their manor, and always under male authority. Women were expected to do it all, and receive no credit for it. Their work was invisible and unpaid, seen not as contribution, but as duty. Education was for men. Girls were not encouraged to learn. In fact, in many cases, they were actively prevented from doing so. Literacy was seen as unnecessary, and even dangerous, for women. Educated women could question teachings. They might read scripture for themselves. They could voice opinions. And that, in the eyes of both the church and society, posed a threat. Some girls learned basic reading at home or in convents, but few had access to formal schooling. Science, law, theology, these were fields reserved for men. The only approved form of female learning involved memorizing religious texts and understanding their place in the divine hierarchy, always beneath men. Even in rare cases where a woman achieved intellectual recognition, such as abbesses or mystics, their work was often dismissed, censored, or attributed to divine visions rather than personal intellect. Their bodies were not their own. A woman's body belonged to her father, then her husband, and always to the judgment of society. Virginity was prized above all. Girls were shamed, punished, or exiled for any perceived impropriety. Pregnancy outside of marriage was scandalous and could result in death, by punishment or neglect. Sexual education didn't exist. Marital rape wasn't even recognized. It was assumed a wife owed her husband access to her body at all times. Women who strayed, or were accused of straying, faced brutal consequences. Rumors alone could be enough to brand a woman as impure, immoral, or even a witch. The church's grip on womanhood. The church wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a moral enforcer. Women were expected to be pure, pious, and submissive. The Virgin Mary was held up as the gold standard, silent, obedient, and eternally virtuous. Anything else, independence, intellect, sexuality, was seen as sin. Female suffering was romanticized. Pain in childbirth was said to be Eve's punishment, and therefore spiritually cleansing. A woman who bore her struggle silently was closer to God. Women were told their only path to heaven was through serving men faithfully, suffering graciously, and remaining sexually pure. And if they couldn't, or wouldn't, conform, they were heretics, whores, or witches. The rare exceptions. There were outliers, nuns who rose to lead abbeys, queens who influenced politics, mystics who were revered as saints. But these women were the exception, not the rule. For the vast majority, life was rigid and relentless. From cradle to grave, women were defined by what they could give to others, never what they could achieve themselves. Their value was measured in wombs, obedience, and silence. A world ruled by fear, violence and brutal justice in the Middle Ages. As if poverty, disease, and oppression weren't enough, Daily life in the Middle Ages was also marked by a constant, simmering threat of violence. It lurked behind closed doors, within village walls, and across battlefields. Justice was swift, brutal, and often performed in public as both spectacle and warning. In medieval society, violence was not the exception, it was the norm. Violence in the home. For many people, danger wasn't just outside their doors, it lived within them. The idea of domestic abuse as a punishable offense simply didn't exist. Husbands had near total control over their wives and children, and physical discipline was widely accepted. A man was considered within his rights to strike his wife if she disobeyed or dishonored him. Children, too, were routinely beaten, at home, at school, and even in church. The concept of a nurturing childhood or a safe family environment was foreign in most households. This kind of internal violence was rarely questioned or punished. It was seen as a matter of order, discipline, and even religious duty. Street justice, swift and unforgiving. Outside the home, violence erupted in disputes over land, resources, and honor. Petty arguments could escalate into deadly brawls. Weapons were commonplace, and self-policing was often the only form of protection. There were no modern police forces. Local lords enforced law through stewards and knights, but justice was far from impartial. Those with power, wealthy landowners, church officials, could manipulate legal outcomes. The poor, by contrast, were left vulnerable, punished more harshly, and often used as examples. Justice was about control, not fairness. Punishment by pain. Medieval punishment wasn't just about guilt, it was about humiliation and deterrence. The goal was to make a public example, to stamp out future wrongdoing through fear and suffering. Common punishments included flogging or public whipping, sometimes until skin peeled or blood pooled in the street. Branding, where criminals had letters burned into their flesh to mark their offense, like T for thief or F for forger. The stocks, where offenders were locked by the neck and hands in wooden frames in the town square, vulnerable to insults, filth, and projectiles from passing villagers. Amputation, where a hand, ear, or tongue might be removed as punishment for theft, slander, or blasphemy. And for more serious crimes, real or accused, the outcome could be death. Execution as entertainment. Public executions were not only legal punishments, they were community events, often attended by entire villages. Children, elders, clergy, all gathered to witness the spectacle. The methods were savage and designed to inflict maximum pain. Hanging for thieves and bandits, with slow deaths caused by strangulation. Burning at the stake for heretics, witches, or those accused of blasphemy. Beheading, sometimes botched and requiring multiple strokes. Drawing and quartering, a particularly horrific fate reserved for traitors, where a man was disemboweled while still alive, then pulled apart by horses. These acts weren't hidden in dungeons. They were conducted in public squares, outside churches, in the middle of bustling towns. Children watched. Vendors sold snacks. People cheered or cried. The church often sanctioned these events, reinforcing the idea that punishment was not only legal, it was divinely ordained. Torture, the precursor to truth. Torture was used to extract confessions, punish suspects, or simply terrorize communities into obedience. The devices were monstrous in their design and use. The rack stretched limbs until joints dislocated. The Iron Maiden enclosed victims in a coffin-like chamber lined with spikes. The thumbscrew crushed bones slowly. The pear of anguish was inserted into the mouth or other body cavities and expanded until tissue tore. Torture wasn't about evidence, it was about dominance. Victims confessed to crimes they never committed just to make the pain stop. This was the justice system, guilty until proven otherwise, and even then, perhaps still condemned. Constant war and conflict. Beyond local brutality, entire regions were gripped by intermittent war. Feudal lords raised armies to settle land disputes. Kings launched invasions for power and pride. The church waged crusades, sending thousands to their deaths in foreign lands. Men were conscripted, willingly or not, and marched to battle. Villages were raided, crops burned, and innocents slaughtered. War wasn't just between soldiers, civilians bore the brunt of the suffering. Even after the fighting ended, returning soldiers brought disease, trauma, and poverty back home. Peace was not a norm. It was a pause between bloodshed. Justice was not blind, it was cruel. The medieval legal system did not treat all people equally. Wealth, title, and clerical status could shield wrongdoers from punishment, while the poor and powerless were punished harshly for even minor offenses. Women were especially vulnerable. A man's word outweighed a woman's, and accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or defiance could quickly become death sentences. In short, justice was a tool for the powerful and a nightmare for the weak. Life was short, and death was always nearby. By now, it should be clear, the Middle Ages were anything but romantic. Forget the fairy tale castles and noble knights of modern imagination. The truth was far more sobering, and nowhere was that more evident than in the stark reality of how short and fragile life truly was. Death was not a distant concept. It was a daily companion, a shadow that loomed over every cradle, every field, every cough in the night. For the average person in the medieval world, life expectancy hovered around just 30 to 40 years, and many never made it that far. A grim start, childhood on the brink. The road to adulthood was already steep and uncertain at birth. Infant mortality was devastating. It's estimated that 1 in 3 babies never saw their first birthday, and many more died before they could walk or speak. Childbirth itself was dangerous, for both the baby and the mother. There were no hospitals, no trained doctors, and no sterile tools. Midwives did what they could, but complications during labor were often fatal. For many women, giving life meant risking their own. Even if a child survived birth, danger still lurked everywhere. Illness swept through homes like wildfire, claiming the young and weak first. A simple fever could turn deadly in hours. Diarrhea, untreated infections, or malnutrition were death sentences without warning. Parents often gave their newborns the names of deceased siblings, not as a tribute, but because they expected loss to come again. A race against time. If a child made it past the precarious early years, life didn't get easier, it simply got shorter. There was no concept of teenage years. Children were put to work as soon as they were physically able. By the age of 6 or 7, they were already performing adult tasks, herding animals, helping in fields, or laboring in workshops. Marriage often came in the mid-teens. Especially for girls, it was not about love or companionship, it was about alliances, survival, and bearing children as early as possible. By the age of 20, most were married. By 25, they likely had several children of their own. And by 30 or 40, they were lucky if they were still alive. Life moved fast not because people wanted it to, but because there simply wasn't time to waste. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion. The reasons for such a short lifespan were brutally clear. Disease was everywhere. With no understanding of germs or hygiene, illness spread rapidly. A single contaminated well could poison an entire village. Plagues, such as the infamous Black Death, could wipe out entire populations within months. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no painkillers. A toothache could lead to a fatal infection. A small cut could turn septic. There was no safety net, only prayers and herbs. Hunger was constant. Food was unpredictable, crops failed often, and famine could strike at any time. During the winter months, stores ran low, and starvation claimed lives quietly in the night. Exhaustion wore the body down early. From dawn until dusk, people toiled in back-breaking labor. There were no retirement plans, no sick leave, no respite. The body gave out young because it was worked to death. Mental strain in a world without mercy. The toll wasn't just physical. The emotional and psychological burden of such a life was immense. Losing children, facing violence, fearing punishment, and enduring religious guilt created a mental strain most modern people can scarcely imagine. Depression, grief, and trauma were widespread, but had no names, no treatments. People carried their sorrow silently, believing it to be the will of God or punishment for sin. Hope was hard to hold on to. And joy, when it came, was fleeting. Death was always watching. It didn't matter if you were young or old, rich or poor. Death could come from anywhere. A cough that never went away, a simple fall from a cart, eating spoiled bread, crossing the wrong person, an infected wound, giving birth, drinking the wrong water. There were no hospitals, no emergency services, no miracle cures. The best you could hope for was a quick death, or at least a quiet one. Funerals were not rare events, they were woven into the fabric of life. People buried siblings, spouses, parents, and children with heartbreaking regularity. Grief was constant. Cemeteries overflowed. The presence of death was everywhere, etched into church walls, painted into murals, carved into wood and stone. But still, they lived. And yet, somehow, people lived. They laughed when they could, told stories around fires, sang songs in fields, celebrated harvests, and fell in love. They found meaning in faith, in family, in the rhythm of the seasons. They fought to protect what little they had. They endured because that's what humans do. Even in the harshest circumstances, they find a way forward. And perhaps that's the most honest truth about life in the Middle Ages, not the dirt, or the disease, or the death, but the resilience of those who bore it all and kept going. The myth versus the reality, peeling back the medieval illusion. When most Americans think of the Middle Ages, they often picture glittering suits of armor, majestic stone castles rising above green valleys, and noble knights galloping into battle for honor and love. It's the vision served to us by movies, storybooks, and Renaissance fairs, a romanticized version of a time that, in truth, was far less glorious and far more grim. The real Middle Ages were not an age of shining heroism, they were an era defined by brutality, inequity, and unimaginable hardship. The more you uncover, the clearer it becomes. Those who survived the medieval world did so not with grace or grandeur, but with a deep, enduring resilience that stands as the true legacy of that time. Shattering the fairy tale. Let's start with the knights, the supposed heroes of the age. Far from chivalrous guardians of peace, most knights were enforcers of their lord's will, often violent and ruthless. Warfare wasn't about noble causes, it was about land, power, and survival. and it was frequent. Bloodshed was part of everyday life, and peace was always temporary. As for castles, only the ultra-wealthy elite had access to those fortified homes. The vast majority of people, peasants, laborers, serfs, lived in mud huts or basic wooden dwellings shared with livestock. Their roofs leaked, their walls were thin, and hygiene was non-existent. Those fairy tale castles? They may have towered over the people, but they weren't built for them. The myth of courtly love and honor? That was mostly a literary invention, dreamed up by aristocrats and poets. Real life was governed by harsh systems, feudal laws, church rules, and patriarchal traditions that left no room for idealism. Women were property. Children were labor. Dissent meant punishment. Brutal truths of daily existence. The previous chapters of this story have revealed the full scope of medieval hardship. People slept in filth, often sharing beds with lice, siblings, and sometimes even animals. Human waste flowed through the streets, with no plumbing, no sanitation, and no relief. Food was scarce and dangerous, spoiled, stretched with sawdust, or hoarded by lords. Illness stalked every home: tooth decay, infection, plague, fever, skin disease. Medical care was primitive and terrifying, involving leeches, knives, and bloodletting. Work was endless. From dawn to dusk, adults and children toiled on land they didn't own. Weather extremes punished them with no insulation in winter or reprieve in summer. Water sources were polluted, disease-ridden, and rarely trusted. Religion dominated every decision, demanding obedience, taxes, and fear. Justice was brutal, often fatal, and public executions were considered entertainment. And through it all, life was short. Most people didn't make it past 40. These weren't brief difficulties. They were permanent features of everyday life, challenges the average person could never escape. Yet, they endured. And yet, despite this crushing reality, something remarkable happened. They lived. They endured. They kept going. They sang songs while working in the fields. They told stories beside the hearth, even if the wood was damp and the room was cold. They fell in love, awkwardly, imperfectly, and often without choice. They raised children despite the odds. They mourned, remembered, prayed, and laughed. The human spirit, tested to its limits, proved unbreakable. In a world that offered so little, people still found meaning, in their faith, in their families, in seasonal festivals and fleeting joys. They developed traditions that shaped future generations, laying the groundwork for art, literature, law, and science. Their resilience is why we're here. The Middle Ages weren't noble or glamorous. They were, at best, a brutal test of survival. But that survival wasn't meaningless. It revealed something profound about who we are as a species, our ability to adapt, endure, and find purpose, even in the bleakest of times. Why the myth persists. So why do we cling to the fantasy? Perhaps because reality is too harsh to romanticize. It's easier to imagine ourselves as royalty than as a plague-stricken peasant. It's easier to tell stories of knights than of midwives who buried their sixth child. The myth comforts us. It entertains us. But it also erases the real people, the ones who bore the weight of that time. We owe them something better. We owe them the truth. Reclaiming the true story. This series has attempted to peel back that myth and shine a light on what life in the Middle Ages really looked like, from birth to death, through hunger, sickness, labor, faith, and survival. It's not a tale of heroes and dragons. It's a human story, raw, painful, and profoundly moving. To study the Middle Ages honestly is not to be disillusioned, it is to be deeply humbled. The fact that so many endured such conditions, generation after generation, is a testament to what humans are capable of withstanding. They were not fairy tale characters. They were real, breathing, struggling people who fought to stay alive. And in their struggle, we find a reflection of our own capacity for resilience, even in a modern world that offers far more comfort but still plenty of hardship. If there's a lesson to carry forward, perhaps it's this: survival is not just about staying alive, it's about holding on to dignity, love, and hope in spite of everything. Life in the Middle Ages wasn't a storybook. It was raw, harsh, and full of struggle. But amid all that darkness, the human spirit found a way to shine. If you're fascinated by the real stories behind history's myths, Thunga's Story Time is your place to be. Don't miss out on more deep dives into the past that'll change how you see the world. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join our community of curious minds. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep seeking the truth.